Good afternoon, and thanks for joining Washington, D.C.-based Jennifer Schaus & Associates in our DFARS cited in 2020 complimentary webinar series. As you know, the FAR, or Federal Acquisition Regulations, is the rulebook that the federal government must follow when making purchases. Our webinar series pulls from contracting experts to explain each part of the FAR. It is complimentary and recorded. We'll post all of the recordings on our website and YouTube channel, where we have over 300 government contracting webinars available for download. A special thanks to our webinar partner in the series, the National Veteran Small Business Coalition Education Foundation. Please visit the website to learn more about the organization. We'd also like to thank our friends at Open the FAR. If your organization is interested in sponsoring the series or one part, please contact hello@jenniferschaus.com. And now a little bit about us. We work with primarily large businesses to help them navigate the federal marketplace. We work with both product and service companies as well as software firms. Our clients span the globe and include publicly traded organizations in a variety of sectors. We provide market analysis reports, contract administration, contract vehicle assistance, and more. All of our services can also be built into a training course for your team. Learn more about us on our website. And now we would like to let you guys know about some ways to reach government contractors, the government and government contractors through us. We offer advertising and sponsorship opportunities through our weekly newsletter and also in our webinar series. For pricing or to place an order, please email us at hello@jenniferschaus.com. Now let's move on to learn a bit about today's speaker, Nick Sanfilippo. You can find his information on screen here. And today we're covering FAR Part 22 with Nick. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're really thankful for your participation in the series, and the floor is now yours. Please let me know when you're ready for your next slide.
Thank you, Arnav. It's a pleasure to be here. As Arnav said, this presentation, this webinar is regarding FAR Part 22. So if you are here for any other purpose, you are in the wrong webinar, and now is the time to leave. Otherwise, next slide, please, Arnav. Okay, so what is the scope of FAR Part 22? FAR Part 22 deals with the general policies regarding contract labor relations as they pertain to the acquisition process. What does that mean? It means it's a one-stop shopping location for all the government regulations dealing with labor relations in government contracts. So it's a hodgepodge of different regulations regarding things such as wage determination, overtime regulation, labor regulations, things dealing with construction contracts and how you can deal with labor in those, project labor agreements, which are a special type of agreement that we'll talk about later, equal employment opportunity clauses, affirmative action programs, non-displacement of qualified workers, and regulations dealing with employment eligibility verification. So for the most part, when you're trying to determine what the regulations are with respect to employment, employees, and labor for government contracts, this is where you want to be. It prescribes contracting policy and procedures for implementing pertinent laws. So with respect to contracting policy, FAR Part 22 contains descriptions of contract clauses or the actual contract clauses that contracting officers will want to include in their solicitations, which is helpful to government contractors in that you'll be able to see exactly what language they'll be looking at. And it also describes the procedures for implementing the pertinent labor laws so that you'll have a heads up on how agencies will go about implementing, enforcing, regulating, and ensuring compliance with these labor laws. Next slide, please, Arnav. Okay, so first let's talk about definition. FAR Part 22 defines a service contract as any government contract or subcontract thereunder, the principal purpose of which is to furnish services in the United States through the use of service employees. So, in order for these regulations to apply, it has to be a service contract. And in order for it to be a service contract, the principal purpose of the contract has to be to furnish services. Now, that is a little bit deceptive because for the most part, construction contracts are considered service contracts. So even if the primary purpose is to build a building, these regulations will apply to that contract. It has to be in the United States. So FAR Part 22, for the most part, does not apply to areas outside of the United States. That includes its territories, such as Puerto Rico and Guam. But if it's outside the United States and its territories, for the most part, FAR Part 22 will not apply. And then it has to be through the use of service employees. Now, service employee is just any person engaged in the performance of a service contract other than any person employed in a bona fide executive, administrative, or professional capacity. So these regulations for the most part apply to your non-exempt employees. If somebody is an exempt employee, for the most part, these do not apply. So when we start talking about overtime regulations and such, those don't apply, obviously, to exempt employees. Exemptions to what is included in a service contract can be found at 41 USC 67 and also throughout Part 22. So, not every contract that you might think of as a service contract is included in this regulation. You will want to go ahead and look through FAR Part 22 to see if your specific contract happens to fall within one of the exemptions. It's not likely that it does, though. If you think you're performing a service contract in the United States, you probably are. Some examples that can be found at FAR Part 22.1003-5 of service contracts are motor pool operations, packing, crating, storage, custodial and janitorial work, food service, laundry, snow, trash, and garbage removal, support services at installations, electronic equipment maintenance and operation, and maintenance and repair of all types. So it's really quite a broad list of contracts that are included under FAR Part 22. Next slide, please, Arnav. The first main category that Part 22 deals with is overtime. The starting point for a service contract is that overtime is generally prohibited. What that means is that when they're putting out solicitations and when you're bidding on one of these contracts, you want to factor in a bid that does not include overtime. You don't want to ask for overtime. You don't want to have counted on overtime in establishing a timeline for completion of a contract, or you're likely to have your bid rejected or not be able to comply with the contract as you bid it. There are exceptions to this that we'll talk about in a little bit, but for the most part, no overtime at all is permitted under these contracts. Approval of overtime may be granted, however, if the agency determines overtime is necessary to meet essential delivery or performance schedules, make up for delays beyond the control and not the fault or negligence of the contractor, or eliminate foreseeable extended production bottlenecks that cannot be eliminated in any other way. Now, the thing about this is that for the most part, you're going to want to get this approved of during the solicitation process, not afterwards. If you go ahead and win a contract without overtime, and then you want to get it approved later, you're going to have a much higher uphill battle to get that modification to allow you to use overtime. But these are the bases for why overtime might be approved. You know, and it's what you're going to have to show to get overtime. Oftentimes, if overtime is permitted, it will be in the solicitation itself, because they've identified a need to say have something done very quickly, or, you know, they have identified bottlenecks that, you know, won't be able to be overcome either way. And you'll know ahead of time that overtime will be permitted. Okay, next slide, Arnav. Okay, the next area addressed by part 22 is that convict labor is generally okay. This is something that isn't intuitive, but there's an executive order that's basically said that, you know, rehabilitation of convicts is a positive thing, and as a result, convict labor is generally permissible on these contracts. So you're not prohibited from hiring parolees, persons on probation, persons who have been pardoned or served their terms, or current or non-current federal, or in some instances, non-federal prisoners. Now, with respect to non-federal prisoners, there are some regulations. I say in some circumstances because what you'll have to be careful for is that, one, the worker is paid or is in an approved work training program on a voluntary basis, excuse me. Two, that representatives of local union central bodies or similar labor union organizations have been consulted. Three, paid employment will not, A, result in the displacement of currently employed workers, B, be applied in skills, crafts, or trades in which there is a surplus of available gainful labor in the locality, or C, impair existing contracts for services. So, you know, while it's permissible, there are some hoops you have to jump through. It can be beneficial to the contractor if there is a need for certain workers in the locality and you just don't have another way to do it. But be aware that rates of pay and other conditions of employment must not be less than those for work of a similar nature in the locality in which the work is being performed. So you can't pay them less just because they're prisoners. Next slide, please. Okay. The next act that's sort of addressed by Part 22 is the Contract Work Hours and Safety Standards Act. What this basically says is that if you're permitted to use overtime in the contract, then employees who perform overtime must be compensated at 1.5 times the base rate of pay. Failure to pay wages, overtime wages, or wages at all, can result in an award of back pay to the employee plus liquidated damages to the government. And the liquidated damages are assessed per affected employee for each calendar day the employee was not paid overtime. This can really add up. So, you know, to the extent, I don't think it happens very often, but to the extent that you have employees who are working overtime and a contractor decides not to pay them time and a half for that overtime, the penalties for this decision can really be severe. So it's something you want to think about. The quandary I think that contractors get in is, you know, overtime is not permitted, but they have these deadlines they have to meet. It doesn't look like they're going to be able to meet them. There's more work that can be performed in 40 hours and employees want to work overtime. So what I see in my practice sometimes is contractors who are in this sort of dilemma of, we need these people to work overtime, but they're not permitted to work overtime. Is there some kind of workaround that we can do, like trying to make them exempt or salaried? I understand it's a difficult situation, and sometimes there are things you can do if the employee is a bona fide exempt employee, and you're able to make that determination. But oftentimes this is just a dilemma that contractors face. But what you want to avoid doing is having your non-exempt employees work overtime and not paying them for it, first and foremost, because that can really, really add up in the end. Okay, next slide, please, Arnav. Okay. The next area covered by FAR Part 22 are construction contract provisions. Construction contracts are specifically included in the in Part 22. These include actual construction, demolition, manufacture of construction materials and other components on site, and painting contracts. Okay, but they don't apply to off-site manufacture of materials and components, delivery of products, railroad contracts covered by the Railway Labor Act, or employees working at a permanent home office, fabrication site, or tool shop. So what does this mean? To me, it means if you have to have construction materials and components manufactured and you want to try to come out from under the auspices of Part 22 as much as possible, then you're going to want to have as much off-site manufacture of materials and components done as possible by employees working at a permanent fabrication site or tool shop. That is a way to try to come out from under these regulations if you can, at the margin. Obviously it's not going to be possible in every circumstance, and it may not be fiscally or financially beneficial to do so in every circumstance. But if you're trying to look for a way to reduce your exposure under this Service Contract Act, this is a way to do it, because the manufacture of the materials off-site and then the delivery to the work site, they're just not covered by these provisions. Now, these construction contracts provisions sometimes apply to construction portions of non-construction contracts. So you have to be aware of that. You may be working a non-construction contract, thinking that you're, not covered by these provisions. But if a portion of what you're doing is on a public building, it's substantial, and it's physically or functionally separate from the main purpose of the contract, it can get looped in. So that's just something you want to be able to issue spot. If we're doing something totally unrelated and then we decide that we need to paint this public building as part of this project for some reason, and it's a substantial undertaking and it's functionally separate from what we're doing, that piece of the contract may get looped into the FAR Part 22. So be aware of that. Next slide, please, Arnav. Another thing to be aware of on a construction contract, although really it's smart to do this on all contracts, is to avoid permitting any kind of kickback. Where we see this sometimes is, if you're using a recruiter or if you're using someone to get labor for the contract, they may be requiring some kind of recruitment fee it's just something you need to look out for, because you can be held liable for those kind of violations. The act that requires this is called the Copeland Anti-Kickback Act, and as it says here, it makes it unlawful to induce any person to give up any part of the compensation to which that person is entitled under a contract of employment. So, you know, recruitment fees and things like that are just not permissible. Under the Copeland Act, you must pay overtime beyond 40 hours. You must also provide sick leave on these construction contracts. And you must pay minimum wage and comply with wage determinations. Now, wage determinations, well, actually, let's go to the next slide, Arnav. Okay, there's two different kinds of wage determinations under the Part 22. There's a general wage determination and a project wage determination. What just stepping back to 30,000 feet here, what a wage determination is when you're bidding on these contracts, the contracting officer is going to look to see if you've used a wage determination when you were submitting your bid. There are, as it says here, two different types of wage determinations. One is a general wage determination that determines the prevailing wage rates within a specified geographical area and has no expiration date. These are published, you can find them online. So if you're bidding a construction project and you want to know what the general wage determination is for a heavy equipment operator in Denver, then you go online, you look it up, you see if there's a general wage determination for that work category. If so, that's the number that you bid for the project for that position. If there isn't a general wage determination, then you can request a project wage determination. And what a project wage determination is it's a specific to the project. It's used when no general determination applies, and it's effective for 180 calendar days. So, you're bidding this contract, you fill in all the general wage determinations that you can for the positions that you can find that they're there for. For the ones that there's no general wage determination, you request a project wage determination, and then that, once you receive it, that wage determination is good for 180 calendar days. However, once they're incorporated in a contract, wage determinations, even if they're project wage determinations, normally remain effective for the life of the contract. There are circumstances where a wage determination can be modified, however, and that's the next slide, please, Arnav. Okay, first, they can be modified by the Department of Labor. It may, of its own accord, modify in part or reissue an entire determination. So you could be chugging along on your contract, paying your workers based on their general wage determination and your project wage determinations. And then the DOL could come out with updated, revised wage determinations for your employees. At that point, you will have to pay your employees based on the new and updated wage determination. However, if a modification occurs after award, the contracting officer will modify the contract to incorporate the wage modification retroactive to the date of award and adjust the contract price accordingly. So the thing to be looking out for as a contractor working on a government contract is, if there is a new wage determination and the contracting officer hasn't adjusted the contract or modified the award, then you're going to want to go to that contracting officer and be able to say, look, there's a new wage determination. Can you modify the contract to incorporate the wage modification? Otherwise, the delta, your profit margin can be affected, obviously, if you're having to pay increased wages, but you don't get any more money under the contract. So that's something you can do, and it's something that they should do. Just also be aware that a wage determination can be corrected to fix a clerical error. You're more likely to see this under a project wage determination. If you get a project wage determination, there's clearly a clerical error in there. It says you have to pay your heavy machine operators, $270 an hour instead of $27 an hour. You can go back to the Department of Labor and get that corrected. Next slide, please, Arnav. Okay, the next area that we're going to talk about is called project labor agreements. What a project labor agreement is it's a pre-hire collective bargaining agreement with one or more labor organizations that establishes the terms and conditions of employment for a specific construction project. So, if you're bidding a contract, oftentimes the contract will require you to become party to a project labor agreement before doing so. And, it may, like it says here, maybe with one or more labor organizations. So it might be that the longshoremen and the Teamsters are both party to the project labor agreement with you, so that when you're bidding the contract, the government has confidence that there won't be any strikes, lockouts, or other job disruptions, that there are established procedures for resolving labor disputes, and that there are other mechanisms for labor management cooperation. This is basically just a way for the government, the contractor, and labor to sort of all get on the same page with, what is going to be the terms and conditions of employment for this contract. They help make sure that there won't be any project disruptions, which obviously the government doesn't want. And like I said, the government may require contractors, or oftentimes will require government contractors, to become parties to these project labor agreements prior to award, or even as part of the bid. You may have to indicate that you're part of one of these. So just be aware of that. Please go to the next slide. This is actually tells you when they may require it. If the project is over 25 million, an agency may require every contractor and subcontractor engaged in a construction project become a party to a project labor agreement. They may be a good idea in projects less than 25 million though, and there's nothing that stops you from being a part of one on a smaller project. Because if you're working on a $22 million project, and you want to be assured that you're going to have labor peace throughout the project, there's really no better way to do it than project labor agreements. Obviously, they are, the startup inertia on them is problematic. You have to negotiate them. You have to reach out to the unions and get on the same page and discuss these beforehand, so they can be, difficult to negotiate in the first instance. But once you've done it, then you're pretty well guaranteed that you're going to have labor peace throughout the agreement, and you're going to be assured somewhat of labor costs throughout the length of the project. So they can be a good idea even if they're not required. Next slide, please, Arna. The next area covered by FAR Part 22, and honestly, this is many sections because the FAR incorporates all the different labor laws. But as a general overview, contractors must comply with all federal equal employment opportunity laws. If you're going through FAR Part 22 and trying to read it like a book, you're going to see that there are a number of pages and sections and subsections dealing with this, because there will be a separate subpart for the Age Discrimination in Employment Act, for Title VII, for veterans, for disabilities. But the basic thing that you have to understand is that you must comply with all federal equal employment opportunity laws. In today's day and age, this is something that I feel like every government contractor should understand. But I'd be remiss if I didn't warn you that contractors found to be in violation of EEO requirements are subject to having their names or the names of their unions published, to cancellation, termination, or suspension of the contract, to debarment, which is obviously the worst possible outcome for a government contractor, and or referral to the Department of Justice or the EEOC for criminal or civil proceedings, respectively. So you want to make sure that you're complying with federal equal employment opportunity laws. This, especially in hiring, we don't often see direct discrimination anymore. What I think you want to be aware of as a government contractor is making sure that you're not making employment decisions that can result in disparate impact. I think disparate impact is the trickier one. It's one that you have to have on your radar. You have to make sure that if you're laying employees off, you're doing so in a way that is not having a greater impact on one class of minorities than another. This can be done by running a disparate impact analysis. It's something that we do for not only government contractors, but other employers when they're having a layoff. But it's something that if you do it, it can save you a lot of headaches down the road. Next slide, please, Arnav. Okay. Affirmative action programs is the next category covered by Part 22. Government contractors have to establish them. On non-construction contracts, each prime or sub with 50 or more employees and a contract of over $50,000 must establish an affirmative action program. That's for non-construction contracts. So, if you're not doing construction work and you have 49 employees or whatever, you don't need to do one. Or if you have more than 50 employees, but none of your contracts are over $50,000, you don't have to establish one. Although one caveat here on non-construction contracts, if you have bills of lading with the government that within a 12-month period are or are reasonably likely to equal $50,000 in one penny or more, then you still have to establish an affirmative action program. So just to say that one more time, it doesn't necessarily have to be that you have one contract for over 50K. If your bills of lading total more than 50K and you have more than 50 employees, then you will want to establish an affirmative action program. Construction contracts, there's no minimum employee number or minimum contract size. If you're working on construction contracts, you simply must have an affirmative action program. These are subject to the same enforcement mechanisms as EEO violations. So, they can publish you, they can suspend the contract, cancel it, they can debar you, they can refer you to the Department of Justice or the EEOC. So again, this is not something you want to play around with. If anyone who's been part of an OFPC audit knows that the government takes this very seriously. So, if you need to have one or you think you might need to have one, it's best to just get one in place. Next slide, Arnav. Okay. The next area covered by this part is the non-displacement of qualified workers. This is one area where I think the government and contractors are pretty well aligned. Basically, when a service contract succeeds a contract for performance of the same or similar services at the same location, you have to offer service employees employed under the predecessor contract and whose employment will be terminated as a result of the award of the successor contract, a right of first refusal of employment under the contract and position for which they are qualified. Now that's a kind of a mouthful, but basically what it says is if you win a successor contract, you have to offer everyone, for the most part, who was working on the predecessor contract their jobs. This can make it easy to just turn over the project from one prior contractor to the next. Obviously, there are times when, for whatever reason, you don't want to hire the people who were on the contract before. Maybe you have your own crew, that kind of thing. The analysis you want to perform to figure out whether you can do that or not is basically, does the contract that you won, the successor contract, provide the same or similar services? If the contract has changed, if you're providing different services, say the prior contract was standing up a data center and doing all the hardware and wiring, and the next contract is servicing the data center and maintaining the software. Well, maybe that's a different service, and maybe under your analysis this doesn't apply to you. The next factor would be the location. Is the location the same? That's a pretty easy one, but if it's not, then this doesn't apply. And then the last kind of out, as I see it, is the last clause, which is under the contract in positions for which they are qualified. So, if you do your own analysis of the current employees and find that some of them are not qualified for the positions they are in, you're going to have to, you may have to demonstrate that they're not qualified for the position at some point if an agency wants to investigate, or if you find yourself in a lawsuit, but that can be a way, if you're able to objectively demonstrate to your comfort level that they are not qualified for the position that they are in. However, all this being said, it applies to certain qualified contracts only. It's broader than this little bullet point makes it sound, though. So if you're taking over a contract, you probably want to do a little issue spot on, does this non-displacement of qualified workers provision apply to my contract? If not, you don't have to worry about it, but if it does, you want to be sure that you are offering this right of first refusal if you have to. Okay, next slide, Arnav. Okay, this last one, or next one, I mean, forced labor and human trafficking prohibited. It's pretty obvious, you can't do this, but there are some ways that it crops up that makes it a little bit tricky. First, there's an affirmative obligation on contractors to make sure this is not going on. So it's not enough to say that we didn't know. You have to make sure that your subs are not doing this. You have to make sure that your employees are not doing it under your nose. You must establish a certification and compliance plan. So you have to have a plan in place to make sure this is not happening. The way that this can be crop up again is these recruitment fees, or through recruiters who do not comply with the law. So you need to be aware of that. And with the affirmative obligation, you really have to investigate them. Finally, you have to notify your employees of this prohibition and the actions that can be taken against them if they fail to comply, i.e. termination, all that. So just wanted to make you aware of that. Next slide, please, Arnav. Okay, and then this is the last part of FAR Part 22. It just basically says that you contractors have a requirement to abide by the immigration laws of the United States, enroll in and use E-Verify, and verify employment eligibility for all employees. Obviously, that's something that all employers are required to do, but you're required to do it as a government contractor. This can be problematic if you're in a jurisdiction that has sanctuary city laws and stuff like that. So it's something you're going to want to have to be aware of, but I mean, it's basic. Enroll in E-Verify, verify immigration laws, and don't hire people who are not eligible to be employed in the United States. That is everything that is covered in FAR Part 22, at least an overview. We don't take questions in this kind of format, but if you do have any follow-up questions or anything like that, and you want to get in touch with me, feel free. I am available. Arnav, take it away.
All right. Thank you so much for a great presentation, Nick. I really appreciate your participation in this series. And to our audience members, thank you so much for joining us today. And if you, like Nick said, if you have any questions about this part, please contact him with the contact information you see on the screen here. And if you have any questions about federal contracting or need assistance with any of our services, please contact us directly. Thank you again for joining us today. This concludes today's webinar.
Thank you.